He fired me in front of the entire office, unaware I'm the secret investor buying the company. Then this happened. You think you're in control? You have no idea who you're really messing with. Those were the last words I ever said to him. He didn't know it yet, but in firing me in front of the entire office, he just handed me the power to destroy everything he'd built. I didn't just lose my job that day. I took his empire. The office was buzzing with its usual low hum when I received the call that would alter the course of my life. On any other day, the buzz would have been nothing more than background noise. But that day, it felt like a warning, a subtle ripple in the air that something big was coming. I glanced at my phone, saw the name on the screen, and a wave of cold clarity swept over me. It was him. My boss, the one who thought he controlled everything, the one who always assumed that his position at the top was untouchable. The message was simple. Can you come to my office? Now. I grabbed my coffee, swallowed the last sip in one go, and headed toward his office without a second thought. Inside, I could hear the faint clicking of keyboards, the murmur of whispered conversations, but it all felt muffled, as if I were walking through water. When I entered his office, it was as if the entire world outside paused. He wasn't behind his desk as usual, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his kingdom. No, today he was standing rigid, his eyes narrow and focused, like a predator eyeing its prey. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. His demeanor had always been a little cold, distant even, but this was different. This wasn't the usual detached arrogance. There was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't name, but I would soon understand. He didn't invite me to sit down, which was unusual. Most of our meetings involved him giving me some small talk about performance or upcoming deadlines. I always walked away with a slight feeling of inferiority, but this was different. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. "Pack your things," he said, his voice flat, void of any empathy. I froze. At first, I thought I must have misheard him. There was no build-up, no preamble. Just a sudden and cold command. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't let him see it. Instead, I forced my body to relax, to appear nonchalant. I wasn't about to beg. I wasn't about to let him have that satisfaction. "You're fired," he continued, as though it were the most routine thing in the world. "I don't have time for people who aren't producing results." The word stung, yes. But it wasn't because I was angry or hurt. It stung because I had been working for this company for years. I'd put my blood, sweat, and tears into making it succeed, and now, it was over in a single, cruel sentence. I had always known this day might come, but I never imagined it would be like this. I stared at him, steady, unflinching, while every instinct in my body screamed to walk out, to hide my humiliation, to beg for another chance. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I had learned to hide my emotions, to keep my cards close to my chest, to fight back. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about something far bigger. This was about revenge. And he had no idea. "I understand," I said coolly, pushing down the hot surge of anger that threatened to rise in my chest. "But you should know this isn't going to end the way you think." He barely looked at me, clearly not even registering what I had said. He was already looking past me, probably mentally preparing his next series of emails or meetings. To him, I was just another cog in the machine, one that had become expendable. "You're dismissed," he said with a wave of his hand, and I turned to leave, my heart pounding as I did. But as I made my way to the door, I couldn't help but feel something else growing inside me, a sense of cold satisfaction. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea. I walked out of the office, holding my head high, my movements deliberate, controlled. I wasn't leaving in defeat. I wasn't walking away in shame. No, I was walking straight into the next phase of my plan. The plan that would bring him down. It felt like the entire office was watching me as I made my way to the elevator. I could feel their stares, their judgment, their pity, but I didn't care. They had no idea what was really going on. They had no idea what was coming for them. But I did. As soon as I reached the elevator, I hit the button, waiting for the doors to close, for the rush of freedom to hit me. And when they did, I couldn't help but let out a small, satisfied sigh. It was done. He'd played his hand and he'd lost. But this wasn't the end. Far from it. I had already taken steps to ensure that this was only the beginning. While he thought he was rid of me, I had been quietly taking control of the one thing he thought was his company. I wasn't just an employee. I wasn't some disgruntled worker. I was the silent force in the background, the one who had been buying up shares of his company, piece by piece for months. Slowly, steadily, until I had a sizable stake in the company, enough to hold power, enough to be in a position to take control. What he didn't know was that the very thing he built, the empire he thought he controlled, was now mine for the taking. As I stood in the elevator, I looked at my phone, scanning the stock prices and shareholder reports. My purchase had been gradual, methodical, and now the pieces were finally falling into place. I wasn't just another victim of office politics. I was the one pulling the strings. And now I was going to take what was rightfully mine. The ride back to my apartment felt like the longest in my life. Every stoplight, every red light, every turn was an eternity. But even as I stared out the window, lost in thought, I couldn't shake the image of his face. His expression when I had walked out of that office. The disbelief, the confusion, the realization that everything he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. I had never been the type to gloat, but there was something satisfying in seeing the tables turn so quickly. Once I got home, I went straight to my desk and opened the secure file on my laptop. The moment of truth. I accessed the company's shareholder records and confirmed it. I owned over 30% of the shares in his company. Not enough to take full control yet, but enough to make a big splash. And that was just the beginning. The next move? It was time to show him just how deep this betrayal went. I had the power now. And soon everyone else would know it too. If you've made it this far, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story to keep up with the next twist, because trust me, it's only just beginning. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside my apartment window, but inside, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, pregnant with anticipation. I was alone but not lonely. I didn't need anyone else. Not anymore. I had done what I set out to do. I'd waited for this moment, the moment where everything he had built, everything he had arrogantly assumed was his, began to slip through his fingers. The moment where I took control. I pulled my chair closer to the desk and stared at the screen, watching the figures on my laptop shift and sway as the stock market reacted. Every share I had quietly bought, every move I had carefully planned over the past few months, had led to this, my quiet dominance over his empire. The numbers were undeniable. I owned more than enough to influence the company's board. More than enough to make the changes I had in mind. But this wasn't about power for power's sake. It wasn't just about ruining his life. It was about making a statement. He thought he could push me around. He thought I was just another cog in the machine, easily replaceable, dispensable. But he had no idea how wrong he was. Now I had something he couldn't buy, control. The only question now was how to play my cards. The plan needed to be executed with precision. I needed to build the narrative, set the stage, and make sure everyone knew who the real boss was, who the real power was. But first, I had to deal with the immediate fallout. I sat at my desk for hours, planning. The company board was scheduled to meet in just 3 days, and I couldn't risk them moving too fast or too recklessly before I could execute my next steps. They would expect a smooth transition after I was out, a typical reshuffling of roles and titles. But I had no intention of playing by their rules. He had humiliated me in front of the entire office. Now it was my turn to make him feel small. That night, I did something I had never thought I would do. I called the one person who could help me solidify my hold on the company. Lena was a former colleague of mine. She was sharp, ruthless, and knew the inner workings of the company better than anyone else. I knew her well enough to trust her, but I wasn't sure she would see things my way. When she picked up the phone, her voice was calm but laced with curiosity. "What do you want?" "I need you to help me take down the board," I said bluntly. There was a long pause. "Wait," she said, her voice hardening. "What are you talking about? You're out. You have no control anymore. They've got you out of there. What are you even doing calling me?" "I've got more control than they think," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've been buying shares, Lena. Enough to make a move. I need you to back me up. I need you on the inside." She was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. "How do you plan on taking them down?" "I'm not just going to take them down. I'm going to take their seats one by one. But I need you to make sure the board feels the pressure. If they know I have leverage, they'll crack under the pressure and vote the way I need them to." I could hear her breathing on the other end, the sound of her mind turning over the proposition. "Fine," she said after a moment. "I'll help. But you'd better be sure about this. Once we're in, there's no going back." I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "I'm sure." The next few days were a blur of planning, calls, and meetings. Lena did her part, leaking information, stirring the pot inside the company. We orchestrated a silent coup, keeping everything below the radar so the board wouldn't catch on too quickly. Every move we made was calculated, an anonymous email here, a conversation overheard there. We worked the system like a fine-tuned instrument. But I was still cautious. I knew the risks. If the board figured out what I was doing before I was ready, it could all fall apart. But if I played my hand right, they would never see me coming. They'd think the changes were a natural progression. They'd think the company was simply evolving, adapting to new leadership, when in reality, it was being taken over from the inside. As I sat back in my chair, reading through the final details of the plan, I couldn't help but feel the rush of adrenaline. I was about to shift the balance of power, about to change the direction of everything. But the real challenge would come in 3 days at the board meeting. That's where the true test would be. The day of the meeting arrived. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my jacket, fixing my hair. I didn't look nervous. Nervousness didn't have a place in this game. I looked in the mirror, straightened my shoulders, and smiled. This was my moment. The meeting was set to be a formality. The board would accept the changes, sign off on the restructuring, and the company would move on. Or so they thought. As I entered the conference room, I could feel the eyes of the board members on me. They weren't sure what to expect, but they were confident that I was just another disgruntled ex-employee who would slip into the background. They were wrong. I took my seat at the table, and the tension in the room was palpable. No one knew that in just a few hours their lives would be upended. No one knew that they were about to lose their jobs, their power, their control. I could see it on their faces, the arrogance, the self-satisfaction. They thought they were untouchable. But I had learned long ago that no one was untouchable. I was about to prove that to them. The meeting began, and the chairman of the board, a man named Roger, stood at the front, talking about upcoming projects and company growth. His voice was smooth, confident, but beneath the surface, there was a flicker of unease. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. I watched him, studying his every move, while my heart beat steadily in my chest. Then I did something simple. I stood up. "I'd like to make a motion," I said, my voice cutting through the conversation. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at me. Roger's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "You're not." "I motion to vote on restructuring the board," I said, interrupting him. "Effective immediately. A vote on new leadership. A vote on who gets to run this company." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Some looked at me with incredulity, others with fear. They hadn't expected this. I smiled. "I believe it's time for new leadership. Time for a change." The tension in the room was thick as I watched the board members try to process what I had just said. This was the moment of truth. The moment they realized their grip on the company was slipping. Roger stood frozen, speechless. I was in control now. I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was the one who decided who stayed and who went. One by one, the board members began to speak up. "I think we should vote," Lena said, her voice cutting through the uncertainty. She had positioned herself well, just as we had planned. She was the one who would ensure my victory. The room grew quieter, and I knew the vote was coming. And when it came, they voted for me. The boardroom went silent as the vote concluded, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, a mix of fear, disbelief, and reluctant admiration. They knew in that moment that their reign was over. Roger, the chairman, stood frozen, a ghost of his former self. His smug expression had faded into something far less certain. It was clear now, they had underestimated me. They had thought that once I was fired, I would fade away like so many others before me. They were wrong. The votes were in. I had secured enough to not just sit at the table but to take control of it. The power had shifted, and now I had the authority to reshape everything. Lena was the first to speak, cutting through the dead silence. "The restructuring will begin immediately. This company belongs to a new era, one where leadership is chosen not by age or seniority but by merit." Her words were like a hammer on a bell, resonating with everyone in the room. They tried to resist. I could see it in their eyes, the ones who were too proud or too scared to accept the reality of the situation. They exchanged glances, but none dared to speak out. The fear in their faces said it all. There was no turning back now. I stood, looking each of them in the eye. "You all had your chance," I said, my voice cool and unwavering. "But you failed. You neglected the people who made this company what it is, and now I'm here to fix it." The room was thick with tension. There was no one left to oppose me. I had won. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This was just the first step. I turned to Roger, whose face had paled, and smiled. "You're dismissed. Effective immediately." He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. What could he say? He had no power anymore. The board had voted. His position was now mine to decide. Without another word, he stood and shuffled out of the room, his shoulders slumped, his pride shattered. Lena caught my eye as she stood next to me. That was smooth. But the real challenge begins now. I nodded. She was right. The board was only the first hurdle. Now I needed to solidify my control over the company and make the necessary changes. It was time to reshape everything, the culture, the leadership, the future. But there were other things to consider. A war was brewing behind the scenes and I needed to prepare for it. Not everyone was going to fall in line. There were still people who wanted to see me fail, people who didn't like the changes I was making, and they would stop at nothing to undermine me. I wasn't naive. I knew the game I was playing. I knew the risks. But that didn't scare me. It only fueled me. Because now, for the first time in a long time, I had something far more valuable than just a seat at the table. I had control. The days that followed the board meeting felt like a blur. I sat in my new office, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, people who were suddenly looking to me for answers, for direction. The weight of their expectations was both exhilarating and terrifying. They wanted me to lead, to prove I was the right person for the job. But I didn't have the luxury of time. The people I needed to eliminate were already making their moves. Whispers spread through the company faster than I could silence them, and there was a growing undercurrent of resentment among the old guard. One afternoon, just a week after the board meeting, I was sitting in my office when Lena knocked on the door. She walked in, her face set with determination. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "What's going on?" I asked, setting aside the papers I was reading. "I've been hearing things. There's a faction in the company that's not happy about the changes," she said, her voice tight with concern. "They're rallying people, making moves behind your back." I wasn't surprised. I had expected this. The higher you climb, the more enemies you make. I leaned back in my chair and steepled my fingers. "Tell me everything." "They're not going to let this go easily," Lena continued. "The old board members are stirring things up, trying to create divisions. They're talking to key executives, trying to sway them. They're not happy about the changes you're making, especially with the restructuring." I nodded, the familiar cold calculation settling in. I had anticipated this kind of resistance. People didn't give up power willingly. They fought tooth and nail to keep it. And I wasn't about to make the same mistake they had made, underestimating the enemy. I stood and walked toward the window, my eyes scanning the city below. "I'll handle it," I said, my voice low but firm. "We'll root out the traitors. Make an example of them." Lena's eyes narrowed, sensing my intent. "You're planning something. What's your move?" I turned back to face her. "It's time to remind them who's in charge. I'm going to call an all-hands meeting. We're going to make sure everyone knows who's running this company. And anyone who doesn't like it, well, they can leave." Lena raised an eyebrow. "You're not messing around." "No time for niceties anymore," I said, my voice steely. "We need to set the tone. No one is safe unless they prove their loyalty. Anyone who's been working against me is going to get burned." The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. The boardroom was packed, executives, managers, even some of the mid-level employees who had somehow made their way into the room. They all knew this wasn't going to be a typical meeting. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and curiosity. I stood at the front of the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. For a brief second, I allowed myself to take in the full scope of what I had done, the people, the power, the future. Then I cleared my throat and began. "Welcome," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "I'm sure some of you are wondering why I called this meeting. The answer is simple. The company is undergoing a transformation, and I need to make sure everyone is on the same page." I paused, letting my words sink in. We've had a lot of dead weight here. People who don't understand what it takes to build a company, to lead it into the future. But that ends today. I'm not here to play politics. I'm here to lead, and I expect everyone in this room to either fall in line or get out of the way. A murmur of unease spread through the room, but I pushed forward. "If you're here to build something great, then I welcome you. But if you're here to tear it down, then consider this your warning. Anyone caught working against this company, against this vision, will be removed." I could see the fear in their eyes now. They didn't know if I was bluffing. They didn't know how far I would go. I didn't wait for any more questions. "That's all for now," I said, turning toward the door. "I suggest you think about what you want to do next." The meeting was over. But this was only the beginning. I had delivered the ultimatum. The lines were drawn. The battle for control was underway, and I was determined to win. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind. Every conversation, every decision carried weight. The company was in flux. Executives scrambled to realign themselves with the new regime, desperate to keep their positions. Whispers turned to outright opposition in the corners of the office. I could feel the resistance building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. But I wasn't afraid of storms. I was the one who would weather them, and when the clouds cleared, I would be the one standing tall. In the weeks that followed, I took swift action. I cleaned house slowly but surely. Those who hadn't been with me, those who were still loyal to the old guard, were given their walking papers. Some of them fought back, but they were outnumbered. The new era had arrived, and it wasn't going anywhere. I kept pushing forward. Every time someone tried to undermine me, I crushed them. Every attempt to sabotage my plans was met with a response that left no room for doubt. I had the power. I had the leverage. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. But there was one final obstacle I hadn't accounted for. Roger. The old chairman. The man who had thought he could fire me without consequence. I had expected him to disappear. To fade into the background, licking his wounds and accepting that he was no longer in charge. But he had other plans. Roger wasn't someone who would quietly relinquish his power. I had heard rumors. Whispers from the few loyalists still hanging around the company, those who didn't know which way the wind was blowing. Roger was planning something. Something big. That night, I found the confirmation I needed. I sat in my office, the city lights twinkling outside, when I received an anonymous email. No subject, no name, just a simple message. Roger is trying to take back control. He's using his remaining shares to rally support from the board. He's planning a vote to oust you. I didn't need to read any further. The message was clear. Roger was making his move. But I wouldn't let him take this from me. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. It was time to finish this. One last time, I would show everyone who was truly in control. The next day, I called Lena into my office. She walked in without knocking, her usual confidence replaced by an underlying tension. "You know, don't you?" she said before I could even speak. I nodded. Roger's making his move. He's trying to stage a coup. He's planning to take the board back, use his remaining shares to oust me. Lena's face hardened. "You've worked too hard to let him take everything from you." I leaned forward. "That's exactly why I'm not going to let it happen. I need you to help me rally the rest of the board, get them on my side. We need to make sure Roger has no chance of winning this vote." Lena's lips curled into a tight smile. "Consider it done. I'll start immediately." The hours before the vote felt like an eternity. I paced the floor of my office, every thought consumed by the looming confrontation. The moment the vote started, everything I had worked for could be lost. Roger had spent decades building alliances, forging connections with the old guard, and now he was counting on that loyalty to give him the upper hand. But he had no idea who he was up against. When the time came, I entered the boardroom. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The members of the board were already seated, their eyes darting nervously between each other. They knew something was about to go down, but they didn't know which way it would go. Roger stood at the front of the room, looking smug as always. But this time I saw something in his eyes, something different. Fear. He was nervous. He knew this could be his last shot at regaining control, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. I walked into the room, my posture straight, my gaze locked on his. The room fell silent as I approached the table, but I didn't sit down right away. Instead, I stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "I'm sure you all know why we're here," I said, my voice carrying the authority I had fought so hard to earn. "There's a vote today. A vote that will determine the future of this company." Roger sneered. "The future of this company is mine, and I'll be taking back what's rightfully mine." I smiled. "Not today." I turned to the board members. "Some of you have been loyal to me. Some of you have seen the changes we've made, and you understand the direction we're headed. But I know there are others who have been listening to Roger's lies. Others who have been led to believe that his leadership is what's best for this company." I could see the seeds of doubt starting to sprout in the eyes of a few of the board members. They were questioning. They were wondering whether Roger was really the answer. "I didn't get here by playing nice," I continued, my voice cold, measured. "I got here by knowing when to fight and when to strike. And now, it's time to make sure that everyone knows who is truly in charge." I turned back to Roger, my eyes narrowing. "You had your chance, and you failed. Now it's my turn." The vote began and the room was still. Every person in that room knew that their decision would change the course of the company forever. The result of this vote would determine who would lead the company into the future. The power struggle had reached its peak, and now, it was time to see who would emerge victorious. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my exterior remained calm, controlled. This was it. The final moment. The votes were counted, the board members casting their ballots one by one. And when it was over, the result was clear. The vote was unanimous. Roger's reign was over. He was out. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the victory settle in. The room erupted into applause, but I barely heard it. I wasn't thinking about the applause. I wasn't thinking about the victory. I was thinking about what it had taken to get here. The sacrifices, the battles, the moments of doubt. But all of it had led to this. Roger stood in the corner of the room, his face red with fury. He didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. He had been defeated. "You're finished?" I said to him, my voice low, final. "And the company? It's mine now." Roger didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out, his head hanging low. As I stood there watching him leave, I knew this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The company was mine now. The power was mine. But it wasn't just about the company. It wasn't just about winning. It was about showing everyone who ever doubted me, who ever thought they could control me, that I would always come out on top. I turned back to the board, my gaze sweeping across the room. Now let's get to work. If you've made it this far, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story.